All right, today's not really an indie spotlight per se. It's more of an evaluation aimed at a particular early access title called Grayzone Warfare. But contrary to an overwhelming barrage of negative reviews based on primarily performance, this one's going to be a fairly positive take on the game. Grayzone Warfare is a pseudo extraction shooter with heavy emphasis on its PvE aspects, but far beyond the state of the game right now. Grayzone is a very good example of what early access feels like it should be rather than what it gets currently typically used for. There's actually a whole lot of context here that I'm going to try to cram into a short amount of time, so bear with me while I do that. The current market dominating extraction shooter is called Escape from Tarkov. Most people interested in Gray Zone Warfare probably already know this, but for those that don't, the market genre is extremely lacking when it comes to competition. Tarkov is a fun game, no doubt there, but it languishes in a state of relative discontent, that is, community discontent, because the developers don't seem to respect their own audience. There's plenty of examples here, but the largest by far happened just a few days before the early access launch of Grayzone Warfare, where the game decided to release a new overly expensive premium edition with enormous pay to win aspects that the community just did not want, and then proceeded to gaslight their own audience with wording changes and policy updates that were about as tone deaf as one could possibly imagine. The result here was that a hefty chunk of the dedicated Tarkov audience now felt openly disrespected, and while some changes did eventually come down the pike, which softened the blow, relatively speaking, and dialed back the greed, it's abundantly clear that without some sort of high profile competition, Escape from Tarkov will continue to suffer under the weight of its own hubris. Luckily, Grayzone Warfare might actually be that competitor. It's not a sure thing, not at this point at least, owing to some pretty big gameplay discrepancies between the two, but even if they end up occupying slightly different spaces, the required level of similarity does exist, where they will often be compared to each other, at least by the broader community. And so long as that level of comparison and similarity leads to a measurable amount of player base overlap, the spirit of competition may actually push them closer together. Just to clear something up, a lot of people, myself included here at the beginning, thought that a seemingly spontaneous early access drop from Grayzone might actually be specifically to capture on the Tarkov controversy, but it turns out that's probably not the case. They put out a statement on Twitter, and whether or not you believe them is up to you as an individual. Personally, I do believe them. But the gist of it is that the game happened to release at the same time as the controversy, despite multiple prior delays, so perfect storm, not so much a calculated decision. Regardless, the game is dropping at a time when the extraction shooter market at large is ripe for disruption, which is kind of the perfect time to drop something that's aimed at disrupting an established market, which gives them kind of a perfect runway if they can capitalize on it and make proper decisions. With all of that said, what decisions are they making? And what's the relative state of the game as it stands right now in early access? First up is the fundamental gameplay loop, because I think they've done some really creative things here when it comes to immersion and pacing. Unlike Escape from Tarkov, you don't participate in segmented raids. Instead, when you load in, you get dropped in a server, and then you fly out on a helicopter to whatever zone you choose in real time as an open world environment. This is a really interesting way to run things because it does give you a sense of going on raids, sort of, just without ever breaking things apart into segmented loading screens with punctuating gameplay. Sure, the helicopter ride is kind of like a loading screen. It is, in a sense that you don't do much while you're on it, but it's also a mechanism to scout what's down below as you're riding. It gives you a much more cinematic experience, and if you really wanted to, I don't recommend it, the map is enormous, but if you really wanted to, you could physically run in and out of the base instead of using the helicopter to and from whatever points on the map you choose, without ever even using it. By and large, it's an excellent way of building atmosphere while preserving the functionality of raiding far off distant locations, and it opens the door to a tremendously large number of potential options later down the line by replacing the existing paradigm of choose place, load in, over and over, with an actual playable experience instead of that. Potential options is a really good phrase to zero in on for this game in particular because there's an enormous amount of potential here based on the framework that they created. Right now, I think you can only have 4 helicopters on the map for your faction at any one time, but imagine if there was a rudimentary reputation system where defeating players of other factions led to some sort of logistics upgrade tree, and then you could have 5 helicopters. It's a really basic example to give. Obviously, I would hope for a lot more depth in a system like that, but the idea of faction logistics is a very open ended question right now that links right into the core of gameplay itself. I should probably elaborate here in case anyone doesn't know this, but the game has 3 different playable factions spread equidistant across the very large map. Each faction has its own home base guarded by elite NPCs, mortars, and I think also a minefield. And then directly outside the home base is a starter town where the first range of missions will take you. After that, the map opens up sort of into a circular track of cities and towns, with the most valuable and dangerous locations being in between the faction bases, pretty far out from each of them, which will then be the arena for tasks and objectives later down the line. This is where the word potential circles back hard, because these middle ground locations, like a military bunker or a fishing town, basically function like arena maps. The open world is massive, yes, but most of it is dead space. That's just a fact. So combat gets funneled into these particular zones where there are things of interest, especially because factions will be simultaneously sent there for objectives and tasks, so they need to cross paths with each other. And while I can pretty confidently say that the PvP encounters are substantially less common than standard PvE runs, the fact that they can happen at any time at all adds a layer of tension that otherwise wouldn't be there. Not everyone's going to like that, in which case they can play the PvE only mode, which is good to mention that they have that. But I think it's relatively necessary to have that tension if you want to attract a wider audience for the game. Since you never really load in and load out for raids, the process of landing and extracting by helicopter takes on a whole new meaning and gameplay dynamic. As you go in, you're scouting down below and looking and listening for gunshots to make sure you don't get ambushed when you drop. As you leave, you're finding high ground positions or hunkering down somewhere so you mitigate the risk of dying while the chopper comes in to someone who knows that you're extracting there. And if you're already there at the location and someone else arrives as you're doing something, you basically get to dictate the terms of engagement by repositioning or going silent, getting high ground, etc. Again, it's not going to be enjoyable for everyone, but it creates a pretty wide range of encounter types just based on where you are or what you happen to be doing when you encounter another group or player. With that said, the terrain itself leaves a lot to be desired. It's a good thing that most encounters happen in more developed cities or towns, because when you encounter another player or even an NPC out in the vegetation, right, in the broader world, it's a nightmare. I suppose that's realistic compared to how Vietnam actually is, which is where the map is modeled after. But when someone can just disappear into a crop field or lie prone and be completely gone from your vision until you're standing right on top of them, it changes the gameplay dynamic from a reflex shooter to I don't really know, a random experience of whoever happens to stumble on the other person blindly first just automatically wins. And it is absolutely not skill based in that circumstance. What's worse than that is how NPC enemies can sometimes just destroy you from inside vegetation cover. You can't see them, but the AI can see you, and it's a bit of a frustrating experience to play a video game and have no relative information whatsoever about what decisions to even make because the vegetation is so oppressively obscuring. That's the best way I can phrase it. Again, kind of realistic if we're thinking about what conflict is like in that particular terrain or that region of the world. But when you try to extract on a helicopter and just get blown away from one of the 500 bushes in the area, and you could never see that person ever to know that they're there, with no recourse for your teammates to even do anything about it because they just reposition to a different bush in the giant jungle. I mean, it's a frustrating experience to say the least when you're on the receiving end of that. Like I said, it's good that they have the bulk of encounters taking place in villages or towns or military airfields, but the scope of different options in play make it so that you will at times be fighting battles you don't want to in ways that really aren't fun. That's relatively unavoidable in any game, to be fair, but you're going to get a higher dose of it here as a result of the map structure. Here's the funny thing though. That kind of complaint, things like enemy design, map layout, PvP dynamics, etc., that kind of complaint isn't the reason most people are typing out negative reviews on Steam. No. That is a result of the optimization, which is admittedly quite bad, but nowhere near as bad as the criticism makes it seem, at least not in my opinion. I did a pretty extensive amount of testing on it, and yes, just objectively speaking, the performance is not good. Stutters, frame rate problems, server issues, even something like hard scoping with an ACOG will drop your FPS by like 20 minimum. But a lot of these issues are some of the most immediate and simple things to fix. If we're looking at an early access game, the fact that the servers have trouble connecting and sometimes kick you off is like the obvious thing that they will fix rather quickly. Something like fundamental map design, not so much. That's not really going to change. So if people want to give this game bad marks because their performance is bad, that's fine. They have the right to do so. But I'm not focusing on that aspect as highly, at least not for this video, because that's kind of why early access exists in the first place. Identify problems such as those, then fix them, with that stuff at the top of the list, obviously. To be totally fair, if you purchase a product and that product doesn't work how you expected or as well as you believe it should, people have the right to complain, and I'm not saying that they don't. But so far, the track record of hotfixes, feedback incorporation, and overall adjustments seems very good, which makes me a lot more forgiving when it comes to performance problems. There's actual depth here. The home bases are guarded by elite NPCs, but those NPCs can be killed, which leads to a sort of raid mechanic if a squad wants to try and go that far into enemy territory. And even if they do, let's say they get to the home base and start massacring the NPCs or whatever, the people that respawn, like the newbies or the fresh players in that home base who are respawning, can go loot the gear from the elite NPCs that were guarding their base, which is this really cool kind of push and shove mechanic where, yeah, maybe you raid the base and you know, kill a bunch of the guards, but then the other players are arming themselves with the guards' gear, and it's like this push pull type thing where you're never going to have one faction just be stomped out and unable to play. I really don't think that that's going to happen as long as the population stays high enough. But regardless, it's actually a really cool system. Out in the world, you'll find keys which unlock various doors and get different chests and loot items and special entrances to locations that you didn't even know existed in a way that might not be fully polished or developed just yet, but very obviously has the potential to become fantastic if they continue to put work into that side of development. The task system seems pretty good. It has fairly solid range on what kind of tasks it asks you to do. The vendors have decent inventory as you level them up. I mean, some are clearly better than others, but decently good, right? Generally speaking. And it's obviously bare bones right now from a loot perspective on what you can find out in the open world, or what's worth accumulating in your stash, for example. But again, that kind of thing is the icing on the cake. You have to have the actual batter cooked and molded before you start decorating the cake, and that's what this game is. The fully formed foundation of something amazing where pretty soon they can start throwing frosting and sprinkles and candles at it as much as they want because they built the foundation properly. Not everyone will appreciate the experience that grayzone warfare currently offers, and it certainly has flaws, but three-way faction combat with PvP and loot-based objectives in a huge open world is a fun concept to me. So I'm appreciating what can be appreciated and recognizing that the concept of early access is meant to be an unfinished experience that gets better over time. Yes, that concept gets abused quite regularly, but I don't see that happening here because that would be like throwing away a rough diamond simply because it's not cut yet and doesn't catch the light as well. You could obviously criticize that and say other diamonds are better than this one and it's not ready to be mounted on a ring just yet, but it's a big ass diamond, and when they polish it up, there's going to be a lot of people that enjoy looking at it. Right now, there's no penalty for killing your own faction, as an example, but imagine some sort of rogue mechanic where you get a bounty on your head if you do that. Imagine if they add more depth to the world where roaming packs of mobs with a boss commander can show up at different places and intervals, which would be like getting raided from a PvE perspective in the middle of your mission elsewhere. Imagine logistics and base upgrades dependent on your faction's overall performance on that server, whether that be PvE objectives or the PvP side, or maybe even a global level of this that incorporates all the servers. And now consider the fact that while performance isn't great, admittedly, the map seems kinda empty right now and loot is a little bit lame at the moment. All of those forward looking ideas are abundantly possible because they not only have the bare bones necessary to build them, they also have enough community interest to get systems like that off the ground, which is an often overlooked component of everything. You can have three-way faction combat with persistent upgrades, like this game called Rend back in the day, which I absolutely loved. But that means nothing if you also don't have a dedicated community to populate those factions and engage those systems. The extraction shooter market was in dire need of competition, right? It still is, and that's precisely what grayzone warfare might be. It's years behind Tarkov, to be sure, but it's got the potential to build into something amazing that either stands on its own or, if the stars align properly, surpasses Tarkov outright by actually listening to what the community wants, which they have so far successfully done. It's not an experience I'll recommend right now as a finished product because it's quite obviously unfinished, hence the early access tag, but it's an experience that checks off every single major box necessary to make me think it has incredible long-term potential, which is a lot more than most games like this can say, and it makes me excited to check major updates whenever they drop. Again, I'm not telling you to go buy an early access copy of the game if you don't adequately understand the risks associated with that, but certainly pay attention to this one if you like the genre, because it has all the major foundational aspects in place to do something incredible. Bottom line, grayzone warfare is a much needed competitor in the extraction shooter market, even if it's bare bones, and it has wonderful potential. And yes, it's got pretty bad reviews right now on Steam, or mixed at the moment, but those are a product of the performance, not necessarily the overall concept, which is the very first thing the development team will obviously be working on, making it a pretty good example of what the term early access is genuinely supposed to mean. It's not for everyone, and it's definitely got a lot more polish needed before earning its full price tag, to be sure, but the level of enjoyment I had exploring the world with my squad of friends was easily high enough to where I can discuss the game in a favorable light. That's it. If you want to support the channel, there are plenty of ways down below. A VPN partnership with a special discount, that's a great one. Locals and Patreon for monthly memberships, also excellent. And more, but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.